Welcome to Creamer Media's Polity. I'm Brad Doubleman. I'm at the Offices of Media Monitoring Africa to meet with William Bird to speak about the Protection of State Information Bill. William, on Tuesday, Parliament passed the Protection of Information Bill. What are the key purposes of this legislation, and how does it go about achieving its purposes?
It's got quite a few purposes actually in that, and many of them quite legitimate. So on the face of it, it should be a bill that obviously would cause a lot of debate because it's about dealing with sensitive information, but that one of the reasons there's been so much controversy about it is because it's trying to deal with two things. One is protected information, so information that the state needs to look after. So that is archival information. It's information that ministers should be keeping in their offices. It's information that various state agencies should be looking after, which of course is a very good thing because you do want that information to be kept and to be looked after. And the current Archival Act doesn't deal with a whole range of eventualities, as well as the difference in technology about electronic formats and all those kinds of things. So there was a very clear need to do that. So there was that state information that needs to be protected. Of course, then on the other hand, you've also got then protected state information. So information that is sensitive to the state, information that is confidential, and information that needs to be classified. So one of the reasons that not the first draft, but the draft that was introduced in June 2010 had so many flaws was because too many of those kind of objectives had got deeply mixed up. I honestly don't believe it was the intention of the state to suggest that the Johannesburg Zoo, for example, should have the power to classify information. Yet in the previous formulation, that is how it was, and I think it's because those two aims and objectives got mixed up. So you then got the one side about archival, important information that needs to be kept, and on the other side you've got information that needs to be kept confidential. And I think most ordinary citizens would agree that there is some information that does need to be kept confidential. All of us in our own private lives like to keep certain kinds of information confidential, and the state does have legitimate interest in keeping some information confidential. There might be agreements with other governments, there might be agreements with the military, there might be certain issues around security arrangements. So there is a need for this, but at the same time that needs to be balanced with our default position, which should be to make information more accessible and more open.
What aspects of the legislation are perceived as being the most pernicious and damaging to a free information society in South Africa?
There's a range of criteria and there's a range of issues in the bill that aren't perfect, and very few pieces of legislation actually are. So I think we're not going to necessarily win all of these battles, but currently we've got one of the world's greatest pieces of legislation, the Promotion of Access to Information Act. Sadly, its implementation is pretty poor, but what the idea was is that these two bills should work together and that they should make life a lot easier. So one of the things that this bill has done, which is a small thing but a significant thing, is that it said it now takes precedence over the Promotion of Access to Information Act. So one of the core issues that everyone should be concerned with is that instead of making access to information your default position and open access, you immediately work within this kind of security closed environment, which it has a significant impact in terms of saying there's a development of this culture of secrecy. So rather than encouraging state agencies to say, let's give more information out to people, it's about their default position now is to say, sorry, you can't have that information, it's classified. And there have been any number of recent examples in the media where information that previously wasn't classified, like our president's flight schedules, which they now say, sorry, that information is classified. So that's the one thing. The second thing, of course, is the issue of whistleblowers, that the protection given there isn't anywhere near enough. In that while there is some protection, it's extraordinarily limited, and what we find in South Africa is that whistleblowers already have a very, very difficult time. They frequently are punished in various ways. They frequently get relegated, they get sidelined, they have counter sort of conspiracies and allegations leveled against them just because they're blowing the whistle. Many of them fear for their lives. We've seen that lots of people in Mpumalanga and Limpopo, for example, for blowing the whistle on corruption, some people actually have been murdered. So it's that sort of level of seriousness. And yet this bill does very little to actually make their jobs easier. In fact, it makes it a lot harder to blow the whistle on those things. And of course, the one that has received the most media attention probably is around the public interest defence. And that the issue there is simply this: it says, if you're going to reveal classified information, you need to be able to show that there's a clear public interest reason for doing so. In other words, it's not information that should be kept classified and secret. It's information that must be produced and brought into the public domain so that action can be taken, and it's not information that should be protected. And that's all that it's saying. It's not a public interest override as the ministry is suggesting. In other words, it's not something that says, oh, there's this override that overrides this. It's nonsense. It just is about saying that if someone does take that risk and reveal that information, they need to be able to say and use a public interest defence that'll be tested in a court of law. So again, it's not like they're giving the media unfettered power, or whistleblowers unfettered power. Anyone that suggests that it's direct misinformation.
Please explain the process going forward in adopting the legislation, and what options does the opposition and civil society have in preventing the bill from becoming law?
Okay, so from here it goes to the NCOP, which is the National Council of Provinces, and usually that's just to check for congruency. Is there congruency between this national piece of legislation and provincial legislation and operations? But they've already announced the development or the establishment of an ad hoc committee that will consider certain changes to this particular piece of legislation. So that's quite a significant step. So assuming that they then decide to have public hearings, they're not obligated to, they may decide to have them, but given the public pressure, I suspect that they will have public hearings. That'll probably happen sometime early next year, and then once that gets passed, assuming again they don't make these changes, it'll then go to the President, who then signs it into law. Once the President signs it into law, at that point the option of a constitutional challenge becomes available. On that basis, there are again a few options. The first and most likely is that opposition parties will group together and get a third of the votes in Parliament. If they can get a third of the votes in Parliament, they can take that piece of legislation immediately to the Constitutional Court to challenge various aspects of it. At that point then various groups can join as Friends of the Court or as amicus, and the case will be heard. That's the most direct, and it's also the shortest version and option of getting to the Constitutional Court. If, however, the opposition parties aren't able to get their 1/3, or for whatever reason other parties that have an interest in it will be able to go and lodge an application with the High Court, then it has to go to the Supreme Court, and only then can it get to the Constitutional Court. So that's going to take a lot longer, that particular option. In terms of other civil society things that can happen and what people can do, I think it's important that people continue to let their voices be heard, that they oppose this particular piece of legislation. If they're in an ANC council area, they need to write to their councillor, they need to complain, they need to object to this particular piece of legislation and ask them to find their moral compass.
In your opinion, and in light of the massive opposition towards the bill, do you think it has the legs to withstand a Constitutional Court challenge? Please explain your reasoning.
I mean, there seem to be a number of legal experts who've already said that there are various areas on which this bill can be challenged. So I think that there's no doubt that it would that there will be a Constitutional Court challenge if it does go through in its current format. What I'm hoping, though, is that the ANC looks at this and sees the opposition. I mean, aside from the security services, there seems to be very few people that actually think this bill is a good idea. So from organizations from the left and right of the political spectrum, from the extremes to the moderates, to people that don't have an interest in these kinds of things, from former stalwarts to business communities to NGOs to people in informal settlements, there's probably the most broad-based opposition I think certainly in our new democracy we've ever seen to any single piece of legislation, and that's powerful, even though the protests necessarily haven't been demonstrated in those terms. When you've got one of the biggest alliance partners challenging the alliance on this bill, saying that they will take it to the Constitutional Court, that's significant. When you've got so many people within the ANC that speak off the record that are also opposed to the bill, it's clear that this is driven from a particular interest point within the ANC, and that particular interest point, I suspect, is about our president gaining control of the intelligence agencies, and that they needing to be finding some other kind of solution to that particular challenge. Although I think this bill, if it gets passed, if it gets fixed, it'll be a very good piece of legislation. But it's crucial that they fix those particular components, and it's not like it's going to undermine their ability to do their job, and it's not as though it's going to stop the president from having that particular control. Although, if, however, you're a cynic and you think that this is linked to a broader effort to gain control not only of the intelligence agencies, but to start to ensure that media more broadly toe a line and that civil society toes a line, then you would say that actually if this bill goes through, that'll be a very clear indicator of the general direction of where we will be going as South Africa, until and unless the ANC is voted out of power.
In the age of WikiLeaks and the explosion of social media, do you think the bill will be effective in its aims?
Well, it might be. I mean, the thing is, in South Africa, internet access is still broadly extremely limited. You know, you don't have the majority of people having access to it, and it's still fantastically expensive. It is a lot harder to patrol, and it certainly is a lot harder to police. We see the Chinese spend billions of dollars on this, and even they don't succeed. So I think that there is a lot of there's certainly a lot of ways around, once you start talking about the internet, that people's ability to reveal things through the internet is going to make life a lot harder for intelligence agencies. And I guess that one of the indicators that says that isn't where our government wants to go is if you look at their policies, they're worrying now about print media ownership and transformation. That's not about worrying about genuine diversity, because if they just look at the rest of the world, those particular formats are the ones that are most under threat, not journalism itself, but print media as a format. So what they should be doing is making sure, if they are interested in diversity and real transformation, is making sure that every South African has access to cheap, fast broadband. Then you can start to talk about a society that's then a lot more open. The fact that they aren't doing that, the fact that you've got an obsession with the media's performance, and when they say the media, they talk about print media. When you've got that kind of an obsession with those things, and certainly no clear as yet wonderful strategy to make sure that that access to the internet is massively broadened, then you're starting to say these are indications of a government that's got other kind of plans that aren't about opening access, but are about limiting it. And once in that environment, it will make it a lot harder, even with social media. Bearing in mind that when in Mozambique recently there was those food protests, the government called their local mobile operator and they called the South African operator, I think it was Vodacom, and they said, stop, shut down your SMS services. They didn't say, no, we can't. They said, okay. And they shut them down. Now you've got to start looking at those kinds of issues, that even as though they were there, suddenly that big operator becomes a more important player. So that kind of environment of the WikiLeaks and social media is definitely one that should encourage a lot more access to information, but it's not the sort of wonderful bullet that some people, the wonderful world that some people might think that it is. Because if you've got too few controllers of that access, in other words, if you've just got one or two massive mobile operators that give the majority of access to that format, then you've got a potential problem, because it can then be regulated a lot more strongly by government.
Thank you, William.
Thank you.
That was William Bird speaking about the Protection of State Information Bill.